I think we might be live. It's impossible to really know. But who cares? Because we're going to have a bit of fun anyway, whether this works or not. So, welcome to Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about a question that over the years of being involved in the music world, I've heard time and time again. And that question is, why does Russian classical music sound so different? And there are a lot of reasons. There are cultural reasons. There are reasons that are historical in terms of global historical timeline. There are religious reasons. And then there are those most fun, intangible reasons. And I want to try to get into a bit of all of that. Now, the first reason is the simplest. So, in the tradition of Occam's laser or razor, but I suppose he's updated it a bit, gone to the laserium show at the old planetarium. But Occam, whatever, whether he's shaving or lasering someone's eyes so that they can see me better in this dark light that we've got, let's start with him. And one of the reasons that Russian music sounds so very different than other forms of European classical music is because it started so much later than just about every other national or cultural tradition of classical music in Europe. Now, the classical traditions of Central, Southern, in terms of West, Southern, Western, and much of Northwestern Europe all trace their origins to the ancient Roman Catholic Church. This happened in the following way. Church music was originally done in the form of chants, and this was the early Christian church. But these chants started to develop in a different musical style depending on where you were in Christendom. The Christian church was always divided linguistically and culturally between the Hellenic church and the Latin church. The Hellenic being in the areas broadly speaking east of Rome, and the Latin church being in places west of Rome, just broadly speaking. And because of that, different liturgical traditions developed, and this included the sacred music performed in these churches. Western churches, meaning Latin churches, gradually became more and more polyphonous in their chanting. And this chanting eventually developed into modern choral singing. And another key development that happened in the West is that musical instruments were brought into the sacred church music, which became part of what in the Latin tradition is called the Mass. The organ becoming one of the most important instruments. And by the Romantic era, the 19th century, you even saw masses being composed for a full modern symphony orchestra. Now, in Russia, this did not happen for the same reason that it didn't happen to most Orthodox countries. Well, frankly, all Orthodox countries in terms of their liturgical music, because Orthodox Christianity retained a prohibition against instruments. So if you go into a traditional Orthodox church in Canada or Russia, Serbia or America, Britain or Greece, you will not see an organ, let alone hear it, nor will you see liturgies, as they are called. So, what in the West is called a Mass, in the Orthodox East is called a liturgy, a divine liturgy. You will not see compositions of music that are designed to accompany this sacred ceremony. And this is because of the divergence between East and West. There's nothing particularly Eastern about eschewing the modern instrumental tradition, and there's nothing particularly Western about adopting it. But when you segregate churches, and they have, of course, formally separated in the year 1094, you see that things tend to develop on their own and of their own accord, based on the cultures that grew up around the church, and in some cases, because of the cultural tendencies which predated it. So that's a roundabout way of saying that while in Western Europe and Central Europe, modern classical music grew out of the church, in Russia it did not, because there was a prohibition on instrumental music in the church. Of course, chanting was and remains a very vital and central component to sacred music in the Orthodox tradition. Now, secular music in the Western world developed in concert with and in parallel to the sacred music of the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the two ways, in the two ways that this frankly developed were folk music and chamber music. Now, every culture has folk music, and it's incredibly common throughout the world for folk music to be informed by religious traditions. Think of the ragas of India, which are a modern form of Indian classical music that has folkish elements, which themselves derived from the Hindu traditions of the subcontinent. The same is true of the sacred music of China and Japan, which gave way and eventually led to the creation of the secular music of China and Japan. The concept of the master drummer in Africa is both something that entertains and is used to connect various African peoples to their spiritual orders, their spiritual traditions. So in the Western world, we had folk music, which had a basis in both Roman Catholic and pre Christian traditions. And we start to see, as we particularly get into the Renaissance era, we get into chamber music. Now, chamber music is called that because it was literally performed in the chambers of a regal stately home. So, an aristocratic person would commission a composer or have a composer on what we would today call a retainer, and this composer would compose pieces of music to entertain the lord of the manor and his guests. Not that different than let's say a Bahraini sheikh hiring Beyonce for a birthday party that actually happened once, or a corporation hiring a band or a comedian for that matter to entertain just before HR tells them that they're all fired or something like that. We see in the Western world that a broader tradition of classical music then develops from the chamber. And this is something that really combined the grandiosity of the increasingly musically sophisticated church music of the West with the secular nature of chamber music. And this leads to a lot of new forms of music that delight audiences to this day, the symphony and the opera being the two most well known. And so you had a situation in the 17th century in Europe where you had someone like Bach, who always considered himself a traditional Lutheran composer. And of course, like all Protestant churches in the Western world, their musical traditions were inherited from the Roman Catholic Church. Bach's pieces were very grandiose. They were meant for organ, the greatest of all instruments, because it is the biggest, it is the loudest, and it's the most versatile unless you want to bring it somewhere, of course. And Bach's music became so popular that it eventually, after his lifetime, became blurred between the secular and the spiritual. You can, to this day, go into Lutheran churches in Germany and other parts of Northern Europe and hear the liturgical compositions that Bach wrote, but you could just as readily hear Bach be performed in a concert hall or in a chamber music venue. So opera and symphony developed as a kind of syncretic phenomenon that combined the grandiosity of the liturgical with the secular of the chamber. And once something gets big, human nature only wants it to get bigger. And as concert halls got bigger in order to fulfill the demand of increasingly large audiences, so too did instruments have to become better at projecting and staying in tune. Orchestras became larger. The kinds of instruments became more diverse as more instruments became invented. And we go from the small Haydn-esque orchestras of the early 17th century, pardon me, the early 18th century, yes, the early 17th century, it's one of those days, people, um, into the grand Wagnerian orchestras of the late 19th and into the 20th century. Now, while all of this was going on, Russia did not have a classical tradition. In fact, just to show how late in the game it was that Russia came to develop its own modern classical tradition, Beethoven's Symphony Number 3, the symphony that changed music forever, that created the late classical era, paved the way for romanticism, gave cues to maestros all over the world that the orchestra needs to be bigger, that the performers need to be better. It set in motion so much. That piece was composed 1 year before the father of Russian classical music was born. Beethoven's Symphony Number 3, the Eroica, was composed in 1803, and Mikhail Glinka was born in 1804. That gives you some of the perspective that I think might be necessary to really understand the overarching concepts that we're rapping about today. Now, Glinka was the father of Russian music. And much like other people in classical traditions throughout the globe that we talked about earlier, he looked to the folkish traditions of Russian music. And in some ways, this automatically made the music different than that of Western Europe. Because he wasn't composing for liturgical chant, and because the Russian state, which was a fully Christian state at the time, did not encourage the mixture of secular and sacred music the way that many in Western kingdoms did. He looked not to the liturgical traditions of the Christian church, the Orthodox Church in Russia, but instead to Russian folkish traditions. And he observed the melodies and the habits and the general tendencies of these folkish composers. Many, in fact, most of them remain unknown to this day. And he used it to create modern orchestral pieces that took the form of the modern European orchestra insofar as the instrumentation was concerned, but not in terms of how the pieces were put together. Now, obviously, Russian classical music owes a lot to European classical music. In many instances, we group them together because Russia is next to Europe. Some would say Russia is in Europe. This is a debate that goes well beyond questions of geography, but it's a question of culture, of anthropology, of attitude, and of politics. And that's when we see this divergence. And musically, that divergence was very much there from the beginning. And that's one of the things that makes Russian music so unique. So while the Russian orchestral traditions from their earliest days had a European look, and dare I say, a European aroma, it was Russian through and through. Now, Glinka inspired an entire generation of composers to compose music in the Russian tradition, but for the instruments that anyone from Europe would be familiar with. And the most famous of these were a group of composers known as the Five, sometimes known as the Great Five or the Big Five, which I think used to be a sporting goods store in the US, and sometimes known as the Great Handful. And this included Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Balakirev, Borodin, and the musical scholar and critic Cesar Cui. And the five of them really are if Glinka was the godfather, these are the regular old fathers of the Russian classical tradition. And although they were all unique in their style, they had a somewhat similar approach, and that they wanted to create Russian themes that had a consciously nationalistic tone to them. This means that they obviously look to folkish traditions, they look to the modern music of the time, which of course were based on the folkish traditions, because pop music as such is a 20th century phenomenon, but they looked at what would have been, in hindsight, classed as the popular music of the day, and they turned it into overtures, musical suites, operas, symphonies, many different varieties of music that were all based on these Russian themes. And because of this, they lacked certain things that European music had, and they had certain things that European music lacked. One of the things they had was a completely fresh approach to harmony. When you're starting from a clean slate, the the natural occurrence is that you're going to do things that are a lot more modern than those who are tied to the past because of being influenced by the past. Russia didn't have specific influences, and so these composers were starting off from a clean slate, thinking, no one said I couldn't do it. None of my influences failed to do it because I didn't have any traditional influences. So let's try it. And as a result, Russian music by the mid 19th century tended to sound very much more modern than a lot of European music. That's not to say that Europeans weren't doing things which at the time were very contemporary. They most certainly were. But Russia developed its musical trajectory free of any influence, and that made it sound new because it was new. That which hasn't been done before must necessarily be new. Now, at the same time that the great five, were composing, or in case, criticizing in the most diplomatic way possible, of course, there was another great Russian composer, some would say the greatest of all the Russian composers, composing simultaneous to the five in the mid and late 19th century. And this was Peter Tchaikovsky. Now, Tchaikovsky was somewhat different than the five in the sense that he had more formal training, and unlike the five, he studied European music and was somewhat influenced by it. However, he wasn't influenced by the music that was modern in Europe at the time. So, people like Wagner, people like Liszt, people like Schumann, he was much less interested than the earlier Italianate composers. He was much more interested in the music of Italy than of the domineering 19th century Austro Germanic school of music that was really dominating Europe, thanks to great luminaries like Beethoven, who was dead by then, but obviously his legacy lived on and lives on, and of course, those who came before Beethoven, primarily Mozart. Now, the German composer, Austrian if we want to get particular, that Tchaikovsky did admire most was Mozart. But the German composers who came after Mozart, he didn't have time for. It was Mozart and the Italians. And Tchaikovsky, even though he didn't set out to promote consciously Russian folkish nationalistic themes the way that Rimsky-Korsakov or Mussorgsky did, he nevertheless incorporated a great many Russian themes into his music, both consciously because he told us so, and unconsciously because we, the listener, can hear it. Now, by the very tail end of the 19th century, both the five and Tchaikovsky tended to be respected in equal measure. During the lifetimes of most of the five and Tchaikovsky's lifetime, they were sometimes exercising comradeship and friendship, and at other times they were seen as rivals. But by the turn of the 20th century, all of these men were considered the great luminaries and trailblazers of the Russian classical tradition, and this led to many of the late 19th century Russian composers like Medter, Glazunov, Arinsky, Mayakovsky, Ledov, and the list could go on. If you really want to know just how much diversity there was in late 19th and early 20th century classical music, I'd highly recommend you going on Spotify and looking at something that is titled ARSM, and that's the Anthology of Russian Music. Now, this was a project that began in the middle of the 20th century and finished at the tail end of the 20th century by the great 20th century Russian composer Yevgeny Sviatlonov. Sviatlonov took it upon himself to record every major piece of orchestral Russian music from Glinka up to the men who were composing at the same time that he did. And it was a smashing success because across so many volumes of recordings, he was able to record all of these great composers. I mean, I'm just looking at a playlist that I've made for myself of all of the volumes of this. We've got Mussorgsky here. Now we're going on to Rimsky-Korsakov. Now Rachmaninoff, a very late romantic. Borodin, one of the five. Here's Rimsky again. Scriabin, a very late romantic stroke modernist pioneer. I've spoken about him before. He was very much a futuristic Russian. I would say the greatest of all the futuristic leaning Russian composers, but he was still very much part of this trajectory that began with Glinka and one could say ended with Scriabin, who died just a few years before the Bolshevist revolution, which changed a lot of things, needless to say, in Russia. I'm just going to keep scrolling through it to find. Here's Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky is an author. Mayakovsky is a composer. Don't get that confused. And here comes Tchaikovsky again, and some more Mayakovsky. Here comes Balakirev. Glazunov is in the house. Shaporin has appeared. meant to, again, say that three times fast. Teniev, Sergei Teniev, the sort of the heir to Tchaikovsky in many ways. Wonderful, wonderful composer. Kotelevsky, Mussorgsky again, Boyko, we're talking about more modern. So all of these great composers are in this absolutely wonderful anthology played by a man who is arguably, along with Golovonov, the best of all of the Russian conductors who we have recorded. And certainly, whilst Golovonov died earlier, Svetlonov lived right up into 2002. He was an avid fisherman. I suppose that's one of the keys to a long life. But he recorded it all. And because most of these recordings are from the 60s up through the 90s, the fidelity is very, very good. Now, Russian music after the Bolshevist Revolution obviously changed somewhat, and much of this was due to political considerations. While they destroyed orthodoxy, and I find that to be one of the greatest tragedies in human history, the music didn't immediately suffer a seismic shift, possibly because it developed parallel to orthodoxy rather than implicit to it, as Western classical music did. But as all politicians do, and the Bolsheviks were the most political of all of the politicians, they tried to encourage a new form of Soviet music that would break from the past. They weren't altogether successful, as a lot of the composers from that early Soviet period still looked to the great composers from Orthodox Russia as inspiration. Um, some of the great composers of the Soviet period, including a non Russian, an Armenian, but who was very much influenced by the Russian orchestral school, Aram Khachaturian. His music was at once in favor, then it was banned, and then it came back in favor. There was a great prescription of Khachaturian, along with Shostakovich and Prokofiev, composers of the Soviet era as opposed to the Orthodox Russian era. But of course, they came into favor later on. The message, though, if that I want to leave you with, is really one that has to do with the 19th and very early 20th centuries of Russian music, where a school of composition and performance developed that was very much unique, that even audiences who might not really care for or about classical music, or audiences which don't necessarily listen to it or are conscious about the history of it, you can just tell that it's different. You can tell that Rimsky-Korsakov is very different than Wagner. You can tell that Glinka is very different than Beethoven. You can tell that Tchaikovsky is very different than Schumann or Liszt. You can tell that Scriabin is very different than Richard Strauss. You can tell that Mussorgsky is very different than Bruckner. And this is because when you allow something to develop in a truly unique way, it will do unique things. That, for instance, is why hip hop became such a unique genre, because the people who were the original artists creating it didn't have access to the musical instruments that others did, didn't even have access to some of the records others did. So from the records they had, they turned it into something entirely new, using what they had at their disposal: their mouths, their tongues, their brains, and their eyes. They observed and they created poetic musical stories based on the resources they had. And that's what the great Russian composers did. They looked to the poetry of the great Russians, and they looked to the folkish music around them. They looked to the history books. And yes, they looked to the church for inspiration, albeit for psychological inspiration, for the inspiration of their zeitgeist and of their culture, more than specifically musical inspiration. Because, as we've said, for those tuning in late, Russian Orthodox music, that is, was only choral, as is the music of all Orthodox churches worldwide. And so we see now how modernity took shape in Russian music and why it developed just so very differently than the music that kind of at first glance might seem similar, but which in reality is very, very different. I love it all. And one of the reasons that talking about Russian music is interesting is because In concert halls around the world, from New York and London to Beijing and Tokyo, you'll sometimes see Russian music programmed on the same program as German or French or Italian or English or Nordic or Dutch music. But the fact of the matter is, the only reason this is really done is because they use the same basic scales and are played on the same instruments. I would say that in many ways, Russian music's dissimilarities to European classical music are much more interesting and compelling than that which makes it similar. In that sense, we can say that there's a European tradition, a Russian classical tradition, and then, of course, we have the other classical traditions, the African classical music, where the master drummer is important, Japanese and Chinese classical music, subcontinental Indian classical music, and so on. I say that Russian music is a school in and of itself. And thanks to Yevgeny Svietlonov and thanks to Spotify, you can now hear all of it from Glinka to Scriabin and everyone in between. I guess that's going to do it for today's live stream. But remember to like, subscribe, and tune in next time. Take care.